You're listening to Feathers, a podcast of stories about God speaking and his people having just enough faith to believe him and obey. I hope these stories inspire you and encourage you to take flight in your own faith. I'm your host, Amy Bennett, and this is Season 4, Episode 3. Well, hey friends, thank you so much for joining me this week on Feathers. First, I wanted to share a few comments from Facebook last week. Christy Newman said, wow, what an inspirational story. I shared it with the ladies in my Bible study. We've been studying Nehemiah, and Renee Law is a perfect real-life example of an ordinary woman restoring and rebuilding her wall, just like Nehemiah. A couple of the ladies have already listened to Renee's podcast, and they were beyond blessed by her story. Nikki Bell said, that call really reminded me that, yes, God does answer specifically in the most incredible ways in that he just lines it up and then wows us. I love so much that God is using this podcast to reveal himself to you as you listen, and I'm just so thankful that we get to share this together. This week we're doing a few new things. The first is that I have two guests this week. It's the first time I've had two people on as guests, so that is super fun to have a little bit more interaction. And also this week is not in the normal format of sharing a story, but Jess and Hayley, Jess Connolly and Hayley Morgan have co-written a book called Wild and Free. And I think its message is so core to living a life of faith and obedience that I wanted them on to do some Q&A and have them share the message of the book. So let's go ahead and get started with Jess and Hayley. Jess and Hayley, welcome to Feathers today.
Hi, how are you, Amy?
I'm doing well. You guys are the first two people that I'm interviewing for this podcast, so this is new for me.
So fun. Perfect. It's going to be fun.
Okay, so I want you guys to introduce yourselves. Jess, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and your family?
Hi, I'm Jess Connolly, and I am a church planter's wife living in Charleston, South Carolina. My husband is obviously a pastor, a church planter, and we have 4 kids. We have 3 boys and a girl, and they range in age from 9 to 3. And that's kind of our world. I'm an online entrepreneur and now author, co-author. So our life is crazy and a little bit wild, and we love it.
Awesome. So Hayley, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm Hayley Morgan, and I live in Indianapolis. I have 4 boys, and my husband and I are entrepreneurs. So we have a kids clothing company called Wildly Co., and that is made in Morganton, North Carolina, and we love doing that. We love serving families that way. So we do that, and then Jess and I also run the Influence Network, and gosh, yeah, I would say my life feels most of the time like I'm a mom, because no matter what job you do, you are always a mom if you're a mom. So it feels like a lot of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I could totally identify with that. So yeah, I was going to bring up you guys. This is not the first kind of project that you've done together. You guys run Influence Network and have a yearly conference. It's a little bit different this year, right? You guys aren't doing the big conference in Indianapolis?
Right. We are mixing it up. So this past year, 2015, was our 4th year having our long, 3-day huge conference, 400 women, all in a hotel. But we wanted to make it really accessible for all women to go to. And really what our conference is about, it's about the idea that women have influence right where they're at. And so we just said, you know what, we want to go to women and tell them that and make it easier for them to hear that message and not make it harder for them to have to spend so much money and take time away from the places they have influence. So we have begun bringing our conference to women all around the nation, doing more regional one-day conferences. So we just had our first one in April, and that was in Charlotte, North Carolina, and it was so fun, so great to get to be with women who might not have been able to make it, away and fly and go stay in a hotel for a few days. So we're on the move this year and heading all around the nation.
Yeah, so I am just outside of Charlotte. I am since you're a South Carolina girl, you might know Fort Mill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I am just kind of kicking myself. I could not make it. I'm like, gosh, I can never make it to the conference. I always want to go to the conference. And then you're like literally in my backyard. Okay, not literally, but in my backyard. All the grammar geeks are like, no, it's not literally. Yeah, you guys are in my backyard and I didn't get to go. So it's good to hear that it went well.
It really did. It was so much fun.
So your newest project is the book Wild and Free. and that has just come out. How is the launch going for you guys?
Oh man, I think it's going like 10 times better than we could have ever hoped. So that is only the Lord. Jess and I talk all the time about how it feels like this book is totally outside of us because it's not really something we could have made happen on our own. So it just feels hugely exciting.
That's awesome. That's good to hear. So I'm really excited about this book because I feel like it fits. You guys call it, it's Wild and Free, a hope-filled anthem for the woman who feels she is both too much and never enough. And I feel like that anthem just fits so well into this podcast because we talk a lot about faith and obedience on this podcast. And I feel like every week I get to talk to a woman who is wild and free, that is really just walking in where the Lord wants them, and they really get to see just God show up, and they have an exciting relationship with the Lord, and they're reaching out to the people around them. And so I think that what you guys are able to share through this book will be hugely helpful to the people that are listening. So just to start off, I think we need to, for me, as I was reading it, I feel like really defining what these words kind of mean in the sense that you mean them is super important. So I don't know. I felt like, Hayley, you talked a lot about kind of the free side of this. I think we should talk about really when somebody is not free, what does that look like? You talk a lot about living defensively and how you recognize somebody that's not living free. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I feel like, yes. So Jess and I joke that we talk a lot about animals in this book, and neither of us are huge animal people.
I was going to actually mention that. I was like, I love the animal references. It actually helped me a lot.
Yeah, that's so funny. We're both like, animals are fine, but they're not like our top pick of things. But anyway, it feels like it fits, and that's just the thing that the Lord gave us to kind of put a word picture around it. So I talk a lot in the book about how women live defensively. And when we live defensively, it's just really the way that we cope with the things that happen to us, the things that come at us, the way that we're made, our history, our wounds, all of that. And so I have a tendency to kind of be like a roly-poly. I have a tendency like those, those little bugs where if you poke them, they like snap shut into a little ball. That's how I can tend to be. And it feels like I'm trying to protect myself, trying to get small so I'm not seen, that sort of thing. And so it is really interesting to look around. When we kind of watched other women, we really realized that everybody has a way of acting defensively. Not everybody is the same, but everybody has a way of doing that. So in the book, we talk about the superwoman, the woman who is like, I'm going to do this all by myself. This is fine. I can do this big project. I can hustle for my worth. I can do all of that. We talk about the woman who is a victim, where she owns that title instead of owning her identity in the Lord. Jess, can you think of any of the other?
I like the achiever.
Yes.
The achiever and perfectionist, I will probably put on myself.
Yes. And we talked with a lot of people about that they don't feel like they're just one or two, that they're like, I can identify with all of these. And I think that that's true. The achiever is the one that says, like, as long as I'm doing big things, as long as I'm getting these things done, that's where I'll find my worth. That's where I'll find my identity. And I feel like I have been that, can be that all the time. And the perfectionist is the one that's like, things will be perfect, and we will find a way to be good with things when things are perfect. But the problem is that happens so infrequently. So it can lead to a lot of despair when our defense mechanisms don't work. I think that's the time that we're most caught off guard, because we're kind of used to operating that way until it doesn't work.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm rereading the book right now for myself, and I literally just read that chapter, and I was thinking, I'm a big mix of of achiever and controller. I think probably both. I think an easy way to spot a woman who isn't living free it is most often just by our speech, the things that we say about ourselves and about other people. And so that's when I find myself just really quickly like, oh, that was not something the Lord would say about me, or that's not something that he has affirmed or that he's spoken. That's me. That's some untruth. And the same with even the way we talk about other people. I think that's just obviously one of those good catchers. Like, how are we talking about ourselves? How are we talking about our lives? How are we talking about the people that we do life with?
So let's talk about some of the things that might have people act defensively. I really felt like when you're thinking about freedom, like the opposite of freedom being a bondage. So what are some of the things that people might be in bondage to that would make them act defensively?
Yeah, we talk a lot about that there's sin in our life. There is we can be held back by the things that have happened previously, that we can be caught in this cycle of shame that just kind of can overwhelm us and can keep us from moving forward in freedom. And it's interesting because sometimes we can actually prefer the feelings that we have become used to, that we can become used to the words that we tell ourselves. That voice can start to sound like truth rather than freedom. And so we can really yearn to be back in captivity, that we can want to be back where we felt comfortable previously.
Right. Okay, so that's sort of the picture of somebody that is struggling with freedom, that is living defensively, is struggling with shame, struggling with sin, might be struggling with fear of failure.
Yes.
It feels like they have expectations. So let's kind of talk about the wild side of this. And I know I really want to define really well for the listeners what this looks like, because I think the world has a sort of definition of being wild, and then I think you guys try to redefine that in that book. So I know, Jess, you talked a lot about this, and I love your animal word picture there with Mustangs.
Yes.
If you want to introduce this concept.
Absolutely. Well, the idea for wild really came from, you can read in the book about watching wild horses, watching a documentary about wild horses, and just realizing they do not need the trappings of culture or of guidelines or anything like that to do exactly what they were created to do. And so in the book, we kind of just pull that string and we head back to Eve in the garden and really picture what Eve's relationship was like with her father in the garden in Eden before the fall, and use that as our basis of what our relationship with the Father could look like. Contrasting to how a lot of us feel about who we are and what we're supposed to do and what our identities are and where we're supposed to go. And, I don't think I've ever actually said this out loud. I don't even know that we said it in the book, but a way that I notice a lot of women not living wild is when they ask the wrong questions. So maybe it looks a lot like asking questions about how something's going to look about you, or how it's going to make you seem, or how it's going to go for you, how it's going to appear, rather than, is this what God wants me to do? Is this what he asked me to do? So a small example is the other day somebody said, what would it look like to really live wild on Instagram? Which is only such a thing that our culture would have to think through, but it's real. I get that struggle is real. What would it look like to live wild and free on Instagram? And someone was kind of commenting and saying, like, I try not to do this, and I try not to do this, and I try to follow these rules, and I try to do this. And I said, if you want to know what it would look like to live wild on Instagram, it would really be to throw out a lot of those rules and ask God what he wants you to post. You wouldn't have to think about all the like extraneous things about, should I do this? Am I stepping on some toes here? Am I crossing some boundaries here? If you just took that first step and asked the Lord, like, who am I? What do you want me to say? What's my story? And what do you want me to do? And I think that intimacy is what we are kind of redeeming wild as, like intimacy with our Father, and the belief that he created us as good, that he doesn't feel fearful about us, that he doesn't think we're a mistake, that he doesn't think we're too much, that he doesn't think we're not enough, that he called us good and he made us with intention, he made us on purpose. So yeah, I think the wild really starts at the beginning with intimacy and identity. So I think that the way we see that fleshed out in contrast is a million different ways, but really women kind of thinking about the wrong side of things and asking the wrong questions rather than positively looking at who God made them to be and what he wants them to do.
Right. I mean, for me, I was taking notes actually while I was going back through the book. For me, when I thought and I was trying to understand what does this wild, word mean, and what does that look like? The things that I felt, and I love the word actually that kind of gave me an aha moment thinking about those horses, is that when they're broken in or when they're tame, and that broken.
Yes.
Versus being wild. And so when we're broken and our identities are broken, that means that we don't get our approval any longer from God. We're getting our approval then for people. And then when you do that, there's all sort of expectations that are not from God.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we get broken. And that's sort of how I understood wild.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, I have this question, and I didn't prepare you guys for it, but I'm wondering, do you feel like a woman can be free, so free from sin, free from shame, free from fear, and yet still not be wild?
That's a great question. I'm kind of been waiting for someone to ask us that, and I'm so glad you did.
I can answer that for myself. I feel like I live fairly freely. I feel like that is something that I have spent a lot of years fighting for, and then now it feels like it is my preferred state of being. So when that feels threatened, it's like a kind of knee-jerk reaction to me to go back to freedom. But I have to say, I have to really still ask the Lord, like, please let me walk wildly. Like, please help me do this. Ask, that I would have the eyes to see how to do that I would accept that is part of my identity. And so I feel like it is possible to do that. We also talked about how wild and free they're more like sisters rather than opposite sides of the coin. So I think it is possible. I'd be super interested to hear what you have to say, Jess.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Hayley said. And again, I'm so glad you asked that question. I was really hoping someone would, and no one has. I think that it's very possible to be free or to be wild and to not be the other. I don't think it's the most healthy. And I think that's what Hayley and I have really realized about ourselves in writing this book. And just like she would say, her default is free. It is. I mean, she really walks in such beautiful freedom and encourages me so much in it. And on the flip side with me, I feel like wild comes very naturally to me. I don't even know if Hayley will remember this, but one time, maybe a year or two ago, she was kind of counseling me and giving me a lot of wisdom. And she said, I just want you to know, like, the Lord thinks you're enough and you don't have to do all of this to please him. And I said, I am really glad you told me that. And I also want you to know that I have never felt that way. Like, at my very most core, an area of my relationship with him that he's just graced me is like, I feel very wild with him. I know that he loves me. I feel like I've done, we've done some battle there. I feel like my identity very sure from him. Now, what I said to her next was, if you want to know the truth, I really struggle working for people's approval. With the Lord, I feel great, but I really struggle with like walking in freedom from what other people think about me, or freedom from other people's expectations. And that's where I learned so much from her. So I would say, yeah, just the exact same. It's really easy for me to kind of walk in that wild identity, listening to the Lord, talking with the Lord, having intimacy with him. It's a lot harder for me to stretch out my free and to walk in my free. It's harder for me. And Hayley and I have just different strengths and weaknesses here. It's super hard for me to take a nap. It's so hard for me to take a nap. And she is so good about napping and knowing when she needs to rest.
For the nap.
Yeah. And I've probably taken 3 naps in 4 years just because it's hard for me to feel free there. But I should, and I will in Jesus' name. But yeah, so I would not encourage any woman to pursue one or the other. I would encourage women to thank the Lord for the strengths they have in one or the other. And I feel like Hayley and I have learned to really affirm each other. And I love that she is so free. And I know that she is also very wild. And And she is already that, and the Lord's already made her that. And likewise, she affirms me in the same way so well.
I think this is so interesting because when I started thinking about it, I feel like, not that I identify one or the other, but I do feel like God walked me through being free first. There was a lot of sin there. There was a lot of fear there. And I feel like I had to get free from all of that because that turns you so inward on yourself. And yet being wild, I think that's when you get to turn around to other people and God sort of lets you loose. But you have to be able to let loose. You've got to be just rooted in that identity. And I think that's where I just really connected, understanding the wild. And wild's not being like, let's do whatever you want. Let's be wild. It really is being rooted, more strongly rooted, and being able to go out and do that because you feel so strongly rooted in Christ.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. It was really interesting. Somebody on Instagram today said, I don't know that I would have ever used the word wild to describe God. And I can totally understand that thought process. But I think it's kind of a way that we feel like it's redeeming the word, because she said that in her mind, wild meant like unrestrained and out of control. And instead, we kind of have looked at it that God is not bound by anybody else. He's not bound by other people's expectations. He's not bound by the things that we're bound by, that he operates wholly in his own sphere. And so that really feels, to me, it's like you have to be rooted. You have to be in the Lord. You have to understand him. You have to be intimate with him. But I think it's kind of joining him in that place where you're rooted to him, but you're not rooted to the things of this world. And you're not domesticated, as we talked about with the Mustangs. And that to me is really exciting.
Yeah, and Jess, I would love for you to talk about, and I think you just posted on Instagram recently about your dream about the flowers.
Oh, that's my favorite.
And I think that's just a great picture of God being wild and doing what he wants.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And to piggyback off that Instagram comment, I saw the same thing this morning, and the person literally said wild means a lack of restraint or control. And I was like, well, what is the opposite of that? That God is restrained and controlled? He really isn't by anyone. Yeah. And I don't want to worship a God that is. I want to worship a God who can do whatever he wants. But yeah, the wildflower dream is genuinely I say it's like my wild origin story.
Yes.
And I really did not had you met me a month before that, wild is one of the last words you would have used to describe me. My life looked very different. My relationship with the Lord looked very different. It was very tame. And it was very not dead. It wasn't dead. I mean, he was there and he was mighty and he was doing work. But it was very dormant. And our family was going through a really tough season. And we lived in what we called the fishing shack. And it was a 2-bedroom, tiny shack out in the middle of the woods that had indoor-outdoor carpeting and was just not a place you'd want to live. Those dark paneled wood walls. And we were living there because genuinely the Lord was rescuing us out of a really hard financial season. And someone had offered to let us live there for free. And so we, if you're in a really rough financial season, you say yes, absolutely. But we had 3 kids living in this 2-bedroom house with no yard, and there were snakes in the yard, so we couldn't go outside a lot. And it was just a rough, not pretty season. We had all borrowed furniture, and our life was very plain and vanilla and sad. And had anyone else looked from the outside in, they would have said that. They would have said this life looks very sad. And right around that time, I was healing from depression. I'd been in a lot of counseling, and our daughter had just been diagnosed with a seizure disorder. And in the midst of all of that, I found out I was pregnant with what would have been our 4th child. And I was so overjoyed because I felt like this thing from the Lord. I knew that he would not give me, I I knew that he would not bring new life if we were still really broken and really in a rough season. And so I just felt so like honored that he was bringing new life to our family. And in the midst of that, I found out I was miscarrying, and I wasn't in despair. I stayed really close to him and still trusted him somehow in the midst of that. But I was disheartened for sure, and broken and sad, and just kind of felt like, oh, more death, more sadness, more emptiness here. And I had a friend who came over who had a really beautiful home and who had a really just vibrant life. And she came over and she was going to help me plant some flowers in my yard. And she just said, she walked around our house and she said like something to the effect of like, nothing's ever going to grow here. Like your grass is sandy. This is all sand. This isn't a yard. You're not going to be able to grow any flowers here. And also kind of spoke the same over our life. Like you also couldn't have another kid here. Like this, not like good thing that you miscarried, but almost to that effect. Like you shouldn't have another kid here. This is a too rough season. Sorry that life's so hard. And that night I had a dream, and in my dream I was standing with her in front of this flower bed that was in the front of our house that nothing had ever been planted in, that was pretty much all dirt and sand. And as we were standing there in our dream, little buds started popping up out of the soil, and it almost in my dream looked like very science fiction-y. And I watched flowers just slowly come up, and the whole front planter was filled with flowers of like beautiful colors and different sizes. And they grew, as we stood there, they grew over the side of the planter and covered our feet and started to grow into that sandy, yucky yard, and just kept growing and growing and growing. And I would say that is one of the only times I feel like I heard the Lord's like audible voice. But in my dream, I heard him say, it doesn't look like things should be growing here, but they are. And it's interesting, if we have like 30 extra seconds, I'll tell you, I found the picture of that flower bed last night and showed my husband, and ended up posting on Instagram about it, like you said. And he reminded me of something that I totally forgot. And he said, I don't know if you remember this, but the week before that, I had been with a bunch of other pastors' wives, and a week before that we knew we were miscarrying, but we hadn't yet lost our baby. And so that can be a really interesting and hard thing to walk through when you know you're losing your baby and you haven't yet. But he said, this woman came up to you and gave you this beautiful word from the Lord, and she didn't know me. She didn't know me from Adam. She didn't know our story. She didn't know we were miscarrying. She didn't know we were going through a rough season. And she came up to me in the middle of a worship service and said, I just saw you, and I feel like the picture the Lord gave me is a woman carrying two broken pots full of water. And you keep trying to carry this water, and you keep leaking because your pots are so broken. But behind you, I'm leaving this trail of flowers out of your brokenness. And so I feel like that is genuinely what that season was for us, was this terrifyingly horrible, broken, barren, sad season where anyone would have looked at us and said, yeah, they're not people you want to be like. They're not people you want to model your life after. That out of that brokenness, I think the Lord really showed us he can do whatever he wants with us. We don't have to look like the world says we have to look like. Our gifts don't have to look the same. Our bank accounts don't have to look the same. Our lives don't have to look the same. And it was out of that season that I met Hayley. We were talking last week during our book launch. Like, this is kind of like our friend anniversary. It was through my daughter struggling with seizures and being in the hospital that Hayley saw a tweet to pray for our family, which is how we got connected, which is how we started the Influence Network and wrote Wild and Free book. And so, yeah, God can do whatever he wants out of barren and brokenness. And I'm so grateful that he does.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important to say that God is wild like that. He can make things grow where things really, the world says it shouldn't grow. And I think he invites us into those moments where, let's do it together. Let's do the wild and free things together.
Yeah.
So I have to ask before we go, maybe somebody's resonating with this and say, I'm not wild and I'm not free. I struggle with a lot of these things. How do you get wild and free?
Good question.
That's a great question.
We love answering that one.
Okay, good.
Yeah. I really think, okay, so I feel like I was a believer. I feel like I believed that there was a creator. I feel like I believed that there was a man named Jesus who lived, who died, who rose again. And I believed that he died for my sins. But I found that for many, many years of being a believer, I also believed that God was looking at me like I sometimes look at my kids when I let them off the hook once, but I expect them to behave better from then on. I felt like God kind of looked at me like, okay, that was your one chance. Now you better get your junk together. And that's how I live my Christian life. And I felt afraid. I felt like I was going to screw it up at any moment. And because of that, I acted out of fear. I acted judgmentally towards other people. I acted prideful when I got it right. I acted devastated when I let somebody down. And so my whole worldview was totally off, even though I thought I believed the right things. And for me, like really living wild and free started when I really understood the gospel, that we're saved from our past, that our past does not define us. It does not have the final declaration over our life, that we are forgiven in our future, that we're forgiven in our present, like even right now, that I know that even though I have the Holy Spirit and I have Christ in me, like I will still sin. And that is like a wicked inheritance that was ours from Eve, but that Christ redeems that, and that he is forgiving me even right now. He's not looking at me like, oh, I let you off the hook back in 2002. I expected you to get it better by now. For me, that was understanding that was crucial to the rest of it. If I didn't get that, like in a really deep and profound way, if I didn't let that sink all the way deep down, the rest of it is, at least for me, was totally worthless. Like it did not have any effect because I was rooting my identity in reality. And it's hard to admit, but I was rooting my identity in a God that wasn't actually our God, like a God that I did not fully understand as much as I could. So that's what I would say. I don't know what you would say, Jess.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I teared up while you were saying that. That's good. We love talking about this and we love answering this exact thing. Like, well, what do I do to be wild and free? And exactly what Hayley said is absolutely like 100% where I would start. If a woman, I think if I was like meeting with like a good best friend who really like didn't want the like podcast answer, she wanted the like honest answer. And if I could answer her like a friend and say, I'm going to tell you exactly what to do. I'm not going to tell you the like 5-step book answer. I'm going to tell you the honest answer about how to live wild is, I would say, walk out the intimacy with God that Jesus paid for you to have on the cross. Mm-hmm. Stop saying that parts of abundance are not for you. Yeah. Talk to God and ask him to talk back. Read the word like it's for you. Read the word like it's there for you. Approach the throne of grace like you're a daughter and like you belong. I hear so many women close to me saying things like, "Oh, I hate grace," or like, "That's just not how God talks to me," or that's just hard for me to understand. And I get that. I feel those things myself. But what we are doing when we discount any part of abundant relationship with Jesus is we're saying he's not enough. He's not strong enough. He's not big enough. His grace, I don't need it. I'd rather just be tidy and good myself. Mm-hmm. And I think the wildest thing we can do and the best thing we can do is just say, oh, you sent your son to die for me. You purchased this intimate relationship, then I will take it. I will take it today. I don't have to earn my way to it. I don't have to make a 5-step plan to read my Bible more. I will immediately right now start talking to you as if I'm a daughter. And I will start asking for your help, and I will start asking for your wisdom, and I will start waiting for your voice, and I will start I will stop saying yes to everything and everybody else's burdens so that I can ask you what your burdens are for my life. And that's what I would say. Like, that's the true gateway.
Yeah.
And I think, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's offensive when we try to say, like, I don't need grace. I don't need the gospel. I don't actually want God to interact with me in that way. I think it's kind of, I mean, not only are we leaving a lot on the table, we're also saying that that's too much for us. And that's also not true. So it's just really fascinating the way that even in our own faith stories, the way that we're conditioned to respond to God and the way that we're conditioned to respond in community. I think that those are things that you have to kind of get free from too. And you have to be willing to like look like the wild weirdo before you actually can be that. And I don't know. I think sometimes you have to look at the way that you've been taught to respond to God and look and see if that's actually biblical. And if it's not, then what?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's, you want a like 5-step process to get wild and free. But truthfully, this really is about, Christ is the one who sets us free. And it really is about walking with him. To me, what I have found in my life, it's just the more I lean into him, and that seems, like kind of quotes, lean into him. I mean, the more I read his word, the more I pray, the more I walk out what I'm actually reading and what he's actually telling me. And that's why I'm so passionate about this podcast. It's like the more that I actually am obedient to what he says I am and not what people say I am, the more wild and free I get. Yeah. And it's not a 5-step process. It really is a journey with him.
Yep, you got it. I would say that's exactly right.
All right. Well, any last thoughts before we go?
I just think that I would say it's always been my hesitation to ask God to do big things, to ask him to do things that only God could do, which seems crazy when you say it out loud. But I would say that my big hope for this book would be that it changes women's lives, that we're not dealing with this problem forever. And this feels like one of those age-old things, but I think it's intensified in our generation. And I am just praying that God would set us free from this, that we would believe him, that he will.
Absolutely. He can do amazingly more than we can think or imagine.
So good.
Yeah. Well, guys, thank you so much for doing this together and sharing this with the world. I think it's going to set a lot of people free.
Oh, we've loved doing it.
Yes. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we go, just tell us real quick how people can find you guys online and find the book.
You can find the book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or Lifeway. We also have a book website, wearewildandfree.com, and you can find lots of other little goodies there, great tips if you want to lead a group, all kinds of things like that. And that's, again, wearewildandfree.com, and there's links there about all the places to buy it as well. We are Wild and Free Book on Instagram, and I'm Jess A. Connolly on Instagram.
Yeah, and my personal website is Hayley, HAYLEYE, Morgan, and then on Instagram, I'm Hayley.E.Morgan.
Awesome. All right, we'll link all that up in the show notes.
Perfect.
Well, thanks, guys, so much for coming on.
Thank you for having us.
Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Jess and Hayley. The book shares so much more, but I hope you've gotten a little glimpse of the message that if you're struggling with this life of faith and obedience, that maybe there's some areas of bondage that you need to work through with the Lord, or maybe it's time to really root yourself in His Word and get absolutely rooted in what He says about you. So many things can hold us back, but I truly believe in the message that God wants us wild and free to live our lives in total submission to Him alone. So guys, I hope you pick up the book. It's linked in with the rest of the show notes over at featherspodcast.com. I also wanted to remind you to leave a review on iTunes or share the link on Facebook. Also, I haven't said it in a few episodes, but we do have apps for your smartphone. So just look up Feathers, Faith in Flight wherever you get your apps, and you'll have a cool little app to listen to each week. All right, guys, thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next week on Feathers.